A journey of truth begins. Malcolm West sat in his office at Silver Skies Airlines, a company he had built from the ground up with sheer determination and resilience. His walls were lined with awards, certificates, and framed newspaper articles, testaments to his success. But despite all his achievements, something about his company troubled him deeply. For months, complaints had been flooding in from passengers about poor service, discrimination, and bias from flight attendants and staff. Some were brushed off as minor issues, while others were met with generic corporate responses. But Malcolm knew better. A company is only as good as the service it provides to every customer, regardless of their background. He had worked too hard to let Silver Skies Airlines become a place where people felt unwelcome or disrespected. Sitting in his high-backed leather chair, he scrolled through complaint emails on his screen. One in particular caught his eye. "I don't think I will ever fly Silver Skies again. I was treated with utter disrespect just because of how I looked. I watched other passengers get warm greetings and friendly smiles, while I was ignored. When I politely asked for a drink, I was brushed off like I didn't matter. This airline needs to do better." Malcolm clenched his jaw. These weren't just isolated complaints. They were patterns. And now, he needed to see the truth for himself. The plan. Instead of launching an internal audit or holding another round of diversity training, which often led to empty promises, Malcolm decided to go undercover. For the first time in his career, he would experience his airline as an everyday passenger. No special treatment. No first-class luxury. No CEO privileges. Just Malcolm West, an ordinary black passenger in economy class. A different perspective. The next morning, Malcolm left behind his tailored suits, his designer briefcase, and the aura of success that usually followed him. Instead, he dressed in a plain t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, throwing on a simple cap to blend in with the crowd. No one would recognize him. At the airport, he stood in line at the check-in counter, just like everyone else. No VIP lounge, no priority boarding. Just him, surrounded by travelers, some excited, some exhausted, some irritated by the long wait times. As he observed the staff, he noticed something unsettling. Passengers who looked affluent, well-dressed, confident, or carrying luxury luggage were greeted warmly, with smiles and polite conversations. But passengers who looked like they weren't as wealthy or powerful were treated with brisk efficiency, without any warmth. Malcolm himself received a quick nod and a flat tone from the agent checking him in. It was subtle, but it was there. He bit his tongue and kept moving. This was only the beginning. Boarding the flight. As Malcolm approached the boarding gate, he noticed a flight attendant named Lisa checking passengers' tickets. She greeted some passengers warmly, engaging in casual conversations, while others received a mechanical nod. When Malcolm handed her his ticket, she barely looked at him. "Seat 32B. Keep moving, sir," she said flatly, her voice devoid of the warmth she had just used for the business-class passengers. Malcolm exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. He walked through the narrow aisle of the economy section, squeezing past passengers shoving bags into overhead compartments and trying to settle into their cramped seats. His seat was near the back of the plane, where the worn-out seats, scuffed tray tables, and faded upholstery made it clear that this part of the aircraft got far less attention than first class. As he settled in, he watched Lisa move through the cabin. She stopped at the row ahead of him, where a well-dressed man and his wife sat. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked, her tone light and friendly. Malcolm observed the contrast. The moment she turned and looked at him, her smile faded. She moved past him without a word. He let it slide. For now. A clear pattern emerges. After takeoff, the seatbelt sign turned off, and Lisa began the drink service. She started at the front of the cabin, making her way row by row. Malcolm watched as she greeted passengers warmly, making friendly small talk with white and well-dressed passengers. When she reached Malcolm's row, her tone shifted. "Would you like anything?" she asked, monotone and uninterested. "Just a glass of water, please," Malcolm replied politely. Lisa nodded but never brought it. He waited. Minutes passed. Passengers behind him got their drinks, chatting happily as Lisa handed them sodas, juices, and coffee. But she never returned to his seat. Malcolm sighed. He was being ignored on purpose. Still, he didn't react. Not yet. The dismissals continue. As the flight continued, Malcolm kept watching Lisa's interactions. A white passenger across the aisle asked for a pillow. Lisa quickly fetched one with a bright smile. When Malcolm politely asked for a blanket, Lisa rolled her eyes and muttered, "We had a limited supply," before walking away. When the meal service began, Lisa offered condiments and drinks to every passenger, except Malcolm. She silently placed a tray on his table and walked away without a word. There were no utensils, no drink, nothing extra. He watched as passengers around him received juice refills and extra portions. When he politely asked for a drink, Lisa's response was curt, "We're running low on supplies." Yet minutes later, Malcolm watched her happily hand out drinks to other passengers. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just bad service. This was deliberate. The final straw. Malcolm had endured enough. For the sake of objectivity, he had held back his emotions, choosing to observe rather than react. But the final straw came when Lisa served coffee. When she reached his seat, Malcolm requested a cup. Lisa's expression darkened. She poured the coffee, but as she handed it to him, her hand tipped slightly, and the scalding liquid spilled all over his lap. Malcolm inhaled sharply, feeling the burn through his jeans. Passengers gasped. Lisa's response. She smirked slightly and said, "You should be more careful." Malcolm sat frozen. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. And that was the moment he knew it was time to act. The mask comes off. The burning sensation on Malcolm's lap was nothing compared to the fire raging inside him. The scalding coffee had soaked through his jeans, stinging his skin, but Lisa's thinly veiled smirk was what truly burned. She did it on purpose. She wanted to humiliate him. She thought she could get away with it. Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination, but something about this moment, in his own airline, in his own company, made it feel like a betrayal. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some had seen the spill. A few had gasped when it happened, but no one said a word. Not yet. Lisa barely looked at him before turning away, already moving down the aisle like nothing had happened. Malcolm closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. If he reacted now, if he stood up and exposed his identity, she would backtrack. She would lie. She would act like it was an accident. No, he had endured this flight to observe, to experience firsthand the failures of Silver Skies Airlines. And now he had proof. The world would see what he had seen. But first, he needed to finish what he started. The aftermath of the spill. A few minutes passed. Passengers whispered among themselves. Malcolm ignored the stinging on his lap, sitting completely still, breathing deeply. Finally, another flight attendant, a younger woman named Cynthia, approached him. She glanced down at his coffee-stained pants, her face filled with genuine concern. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked softly. Malcolm nodded once. "I could use some ice." Cynthia nodded quickly and disappeared down the aisle. Seconds later, she returned with a small bag of ice wrapped in a napkin. "I'm really sorry," she said as she handed it to him. "Let me know if you need anything else." Her concern was genuine. She wasn't like Lisa. Malcolm gave her a small nod of thanks, placing the cold ice on his lap to ease the burn. Lisa, on the other hand, never looked back. Passengers began to notice. Malcolm wasn't the only one who had noticed Lisa's behavior. The elderly woman sitting across the aisle leaned forward, frowning deeply. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "I saw what happened. That wasn't an accident. Malcolm turned his head, meeting her gaze. She's been treating you differently this whole flight, she continued. It's unacceptable. A few others nodded subtly, though no one spoke too loudly. Malcolm appreciated the support, but he still had a role to play. He wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet. Instead, he simply smiled politely and said, "Thank you for noticing." The woman looked like she wanted to say more, but she hesitated. Because deep down, they both knew the truth. Lisa wouldn't have done this to a white passenger. Lisa wouldn't have done this to a businessman in a suit. Lisa did this because she thought she could get away with it. Malcolm had seen enough. The final test. As the flight neared its final hour, Lisa continued her rounds, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. She had already mentally erased him from her mind. She thought he wouldn't complain. She thought he was just another passenger who would walk off the plane humiliated and ignored. She was wrong. Malcolm knew he had one more chance to test her. He waited. And then, when Lisa passed by one last time, he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady. "Could I get another drink, please?" Lisa stopped. For a second, her mask slipped. She glared at him, eyes flashing with something ugly and unfiltered. Then, just as quickly, she forced a tight smile. "We're out of drinks," she said flatly. Malcolm stared at her. She was lying. He had seen her handing out drinks just seconds ago. But Lisa stood her ground, as if daring him to argue. For a moment, Malcolm said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. Lisa smirked, then turned and walked away. She had no idea. The landing and the reckoning. As the plane descended, Malcolm's mind was already racing. How many other passengers had endured this treatment? How many times had complaints been ignored? How deep did this problem go within Silver Skies Airlines? He would find out soon enough. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Malcolm felt a strange sense of calm. This was it. The mask was coming off. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Lisa unbuckled and stood near the front of the plane, watching as passengers gathered their belongings. Malcolm stayed seated, waiting until the aisle emptied out. And then he stood. Lisa turned her head just as he stepped into the aisle. And then, in a low but powerful voice, he said the words that would change everything. "Lisa, do you know who I am?" She froze. Her eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Excuse me," she said, her voice uncertain. Malcolm stepped closer, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Let me ask you again. Do you know who I am?" Lisa's breath hitched. She looked nervous now, confused, unsure. For the first time, she wasn't in control. "I am not sure what you mean, sir," she stammered. Malcolm's eyes hardened. "My name is Malcolm West. I am the CEO of Silver Skies Airlines." The moment the words left his mouth, Lisa's face turned ghost white. Passengers around them gasped. A few heads snapped toward them in shock. Lisa stumbled backward, her entire posture shifting from arrogance to terror. You're joking," she whispered. Malcolm reached into his back pocket and pulled out his business card. He held it up so she could see. Lisa's hand trembled. She reached for the card, her fingers shaking as she read the name. Malcolm West, Chief Executive Officer. Silver Skies Airlines. She gasped. She looked like she was going to faint. Malcolm tucked the card back into his pocket. Then, in a steady, measured voice, he said, "We need to talk." Lisa didn't move. She couldn't. For the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. And Malcolm, he was just getting started. Judgment Day begins. Lisa stood frozen, her fingers still clutching the CEO's business card, as if holding onto it would somehow change the reality unfolding around her. Passengers who had heard the revelation were now staring, whispers rippling through the cabin like an electric current. Some looked shocked, some amused, and others angry as they finally pieced together who Lisa had been mistreating all along. The Malcolm West, CEO of Silver Skies Airlines. Lisa's face turned a horrified shade of pale. Her lips parted, her breath coming out in shallow, panicked gasps. You're lying," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, watching as Lisa's entire demeanor crumbled. Gone was the arrogant, dismissive flight attendant. Now she was just a woman who had realized she had dug her own grave. "I don't lie, Lisa." His voice was calm, but beneath it, there was steel. Lisa swallowed hard. Her entire body was rigid, as if her brain was desperately trying to figure out a way out of this mess. But there was none. Passengers around them stepped aside, some pulling out their phones, ready to record what was about to happen. This was no longer just a confrontation. This was a reckoning, a silent courtroom. The flight crew, who had been standing near the cockpit, exchanged anxious glances. Cynthia, the flight attendant who had helped Malcolm earlier, gasped. She had been polite and professional, and now she realized who she had been serving. Lisa, however, looked like a trapped animal. Her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for an escape route. But there was no escape. She had nowhere to run. The passengers had seen what she did. Malcolm had experienced it firsthand, and now she would have to face the consequences. "You treated me differently," Malcolm said, his voice even and firm. "From the moment I stepped on this flight, you ignored me, dismissed me, and openly disrespected me." Lisa shook her head quickly. "Sir, I didn't mean." "You spilled hot coffee on me, Lisa." His tone did not rise, but the weight behind it made Lisa flinch. "And then, instead of apologizing, you acted like it was my fault." A few passengers muttered angrily, shaking their heads. Malcolm took a step forward, and Lisa physically recoiled. "You thought I was just another black passenger in economy class, someone you could ignore, someone you could dismiss, someone whose complaints wouldn't matter." Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because what could she say? Everything Malcolm said was true. The passengers had seen it. They had felt the tension. And now she had nowhere to hide. "Say something, Lisa." Malcolm's voice was softer now, almost mocking. Lisa gritted her teeth, her hands clenching into fists. I didn't know, sir," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky and weak. "I didn't know who you were." Malcolm's expression didn't change. Then he chuckled. A cold, humorless chuckle. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Lisa blinked rapidly, her breathing growing more erratic. "If I had walked onto this plane in a $5,000 suit, carrying a designer bag, you would have treated me like royalty. If I had been a white businessman, you would have rushed to serve me with a smile. But because I looked like a regular black man in economy class, I wasn't worth your time." Lisa's legs wobbled, and for a second, it looked like she was going to collapse. Malcolm took another step closer. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "How many other passengers have you treated like this, Lisa?" Lisa's mouth trembled. "How many people have walked off this plane feeling invisible, disrespected, less than human?" Lisa whimpered, but she had no answer. Because she knew the truth. And so did Malcolm. The captain steps in. The cockpit door suddenly opened, and the pilot stepped out, his face stern and unreadable. "Mr. West," he said cautiously, is there a problem here?" Malcolm slowly turned to him, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as knives. "I'm afraid there is, Captain." The captain stiffened. He had clearly heard the whispers. He had likely been informed that Malcolm West was on board. Lisa instinctively took a step behind the pilot, as if he could protect her from the wrath of the CEO. But the pilot didn't move. He was a seasoned professional. He knew what was happening. And he wasn't about to interfere. Malcolm turned to Cynthia, the younger flight attendant who had been kind to him. "Cynthia," he said, his voice measured, "did you see what happened today?" Cynthia hesitated. She was young. She wasn't sure if she should speak against her colleague. But then she met Malcolm's eyes. And she realized this was bigger than her job. This was about doing the right thing. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice firm. "I saw everything." Lisa jerked as if she had been stabbed. She turned to Cynthia, her face twisted with betrayal. "You saw me being ignored," Malcolm continued. "You saw me being dismissed. You saw Lisa treat me differently than other passengers." Cynthia nodded. "Yes, sir." Lisa's face collapsed. Malcolm turned back to the captain, his voice dripping with finality. "This woman should not be employed by Silver Skies Airlines." Lisa let out a strangled sob. "She has humiliated me. She has mistreated passengers. She has tarnished this company's reputation. And effective immediately, she is fired." Lisa let out a choked gasp. You can't do that," she wailed. "You can't just fire me here. I have a contract. I need this job." Malcolm's expression never wavered. "You needed this job when you were spilling coffee on passengers. You needed this job when you were sneering at me. But now, you don't deserve it." Lisa sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. The pilot nodded grimly, signaling to an airport security officer who had just boarded. "Escort her off the plane," he ordered. Lisa let out a shuddering sob, but she didn't fight. She knew it was over. As she was led off the aircraft, Malcolm turned to the passengers. "On behalf of Silver Skies Airlines, I want to personally apologize for what you all witnessed today." The passengers nodded, some even clapping softly. This company will be making major changes, starting today. And with that, Malcolm walked down the aisle, stepping off the plane, a storm brewing in his eyes. Lisa was only the beginning. Malcolm West was about to tear down the walls of discrimination, brick by brick. And no one would stop him. A reckoning at Silver Skies Airlines. The airport terminal was silent as Lisa was escorted away, her shoulders hunched, her eyes wide with disbelief. The once confident, dismissive flight attendant had been reduced to a shaking mess in a matter of minutes. But Malcolm West wasn't done. Not even close. The stain of Lisa's behavior didn't just stop with her termination. It ran deeper. It had roots in Silver Skies Airlines itself, and Malcolm was about to rip them out. A boardroom awaits a storm. By the time Malcolm left the airport, the news had already spread. The CEO of Silver Skies, GOE's UNDRCOVER, as APASCNGER, and XPOZ's DICCURINLIAAT, Hoen, CEO HUMILIATED by his own employee, Silver Skies in TRSS. Malcolm's phone buzzed relentlessly, but he ignored it. His mind was set on one thing: the emergency board meeting waiting for him at Silver Skies corporate headquarters. A black luxury sedan pulled up outside the terminal. The driver hurried out, opening the door, but Malcolm barely acknowledged him as he slid inside, his face like stone. Straight to headquarters. The driver, sensing the tension in the air, nodded quickly and pulled into traffic. Malcolm's eyes flickered as he watched the city lights blur past. He had spent years building this airline, fighting against odds, breaking through barriers, proving himself in an industry that had never been kind to men like him. And now, he had uncovered a sickness within his own company, a culture that allowed people like Lisa to thrive, a system that dismissed complaints, a failure of leadership, and he refused to be part of the problem. Tonight, heads would roll. A meeting of power and fear. By the time Malcolm arrived at Silver Skies Airlines headquarters, the boardroom was full. The company's highest-ranking executives, directors, legal advisors, and PR specialists sat around a long glass conference table, their expressions uneasy. Most had already seen the headlines. Some had even watched videos from passengers who had recorded the confrontation. They knew this was serious. As Malcolm stepped inside, the room fell silent. The atmosphere was tense. A few executives exchanged nervous glances. Finally, the chairman of the board, an older man with silver hair and a crisp suit, cleared his throat. "Malcolm," he said carefully, "we heard what happened. We've been monitoring the situation all day." Malcolm walked slowly toward the head of the table, placing both hands firmly on the polished surface. His voice was low, controlled, but ice-cold. "Then let me ask you something." His gaze swept the room. "How many times have we ignored complaints like mine?" No one spoke. "How many passengers have been mistreated?" The chief operating officer shifted in his seat. "Malcolm, we understand you had a terrible experience, but perhaps this isn't isolated." Malcolm slammed his palm against the table. "Do not tell me this is isolated." The room jumped at the sudden crack of his hand hitting the wood. "I've read the reports. I've seen the complaints. I lived it firsthand. And you're sitting here telling me that it's an accident." His voice grew sharper. "How many times have passengers been ignored, disrespected, belittled, simply because they didn't fit the image of a desirable customer?" A few executives avoided his gaze. They knew exactly what he was talking about. Silver Skies was known for prioritizing high-value customers. Wealthy businessmen, first-class travelers, people who looked the part. But passengers in economy, passengers of color, passengers who didn't seem important, they were treated like afterthoughts. And Malcolm had the proof. He turned to Caroline, the airline's chief of customer relations. "Caroline, how many discrimination complaints have we received in the last year?" Caroline hesitated, flipping through a folder in front of her. We've received several." "How many?" Malcolm pressed. Caroline swallowed. "Over 600. A heavy silence fell over the room. 600. Lisa was not an isolated case. She was just the tip of the iceberg. Silver Skies had been letting this happen for years. Malcolm exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. "Enough. We are done ignoring this. The purge begins." Malcolm straightened, his commanding presence filling the room. "Effective immediately. There will be consequences." The executives leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "Lisa is fired. That's non-negotiable. But she's just one person. We need to clean house." Malcolm turned to the director of human resources. "I want a full internal investigation on every employee who has had multiple discrimination complaints. If they're guilty, they're gone." The HR director nodded quickly, scribbling notes. "I want a full restructuring of our training programs. New mandatory sessions on racial bias, inclusivity, and passenger respect for every single staff member. If they fail the training, they're fired. No exceptions." More nods. "We're also launching a direct customer feedback portal so that every single complaint is recorded, tracked, and addressed. No more brushing off passengers." The executives murmured among themselves, some shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't just a policy change. This was a company-wide reckoning. Malcolm's gaze hardened. "And finally, there will be a zero-tolerance policy moving forward. Any employee who disrespects, belittles, or discriminates against a passenger is out. Immediately." A few executives looked pale. One of the vice presidents cleared his throat. "Malcolm, these changes are extreme. Do you really think this is necessary?" Malcolm turned his gaze toward him like a laser beam. "You think this is extreme? A woman spilled hot coffee on me, on purpose, and then had the audacity to smirk about it. So yeah, I think this is necessary." The vice president shut his mouth. Malcolm straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "I built this airline from nothing. I will not let it become a company that tolerates discrimination. This is my airline. And if you don't like these changes, you can leave too." Silence. Then, Caroline, the customer relations chief, spoke up. "I support this." Then the HR director. I do too. One by one, the executives nodded. The tide had turned. Malcolm exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. This was just the beginning. Silver Skies Airlines would never be the same again, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. No more second chances. The weight of Malcolm's words still hung in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. The boardroom, once filled with executives who thought they could dodge responsibility, was now a place of reckoning. Everyone present knew that this moment would define the future of Silver Skies Airlines. This was no longer just a policy meeting. This was a revolution, and Malcolm was leading it. The old guard pushes back. Despite the mounting pressure, there were still a few holdouts. A gray-haired executive named Richard Vaughn, one of Silver Skies' longest-serving board members, finally spoke. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, his voice calm but calculated. "Malcolm, I hear what you're saying, but we have to consider the bigger picture. Airlines operate on very fine margins. The last thing we need is a PR disaster and an employee shakeup that disrupts operations." His tone was level, but Malcolm knew what he was really saying. Richard wasn't against discrimination. He was against the cost of fixing it. Malcolm's gaze hardened. The bigger picture. That's exactly what I'm looking at, Richard. This company is rotting from the inside. I am going to fix it, whether you like it or not. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but kept his face neutral. I understand what you're trying to do, Malcolm. But what if we take a softer approach? Maybe we start with private warnings, gradual retraining. Malcolm cut him off immediately. Gradual, he scoffed. How gradual do you think a cup of hot coffee spilling in my lap felt? The room fell silent again. Malcolm wasn't just angry, he was furious. He had seen firsthand what Silver Skies had become. And the old guard, like Richard, wanted to preserve the status quo. Let me be clear. I am not here to make you comfortable, Richard. I am here to clean up this mess. If you don't have the stomach for that, then step aside. A few executives exchanged nervous glances. They were seeing a side of Malcolm they had never seen before. This was not the calm, measured CEO they were used to. This was a man at war. A direct message to every employee. Malcolm turned to the HR director, his voice sharp. I want a full, independent investigation into employee conduct. Every department, every flight, every passenger complaint in the last 3 years. The HR director nodded stiffly, scribbling notes. And I want a message sent out, right now, to every Silver Skies employee. I'll dictate it. The room waited as Malcolm turned toward Caroline, the customer relations chief. Caroline, take this down. She quickly grabbed a tablet, ready to type. Malcolm's voice rang through the room, clear and unwavering. Official statement from Malcolm West, CEO of Silver Skies Airlines. Effective immediately, Silver Skies Airlines will no longer tolerate discrimination, disrespect, or neglect toward passengers of any kind. Every employee, from our flight attendants to our highest-ranking executives, will be held accountable for their actions. Over the past few years, Silver Skies has received hundreds of complaints regarding biased treatment. Many of these complaints were ignored, dismissed, or buried under corporate bureaucracy. That ends today. There will be no second chances for those who refuse to uphold our values of respect, integrity, and service. Discriminatory behavior will result in immediate termination, regardless of position or tenure. A full investigation into past complaints is underway, and any employee found guilty of misconduct will face appropriate consequences. We will be launching a new passenger feedback system where every concern will be heard and addressed. Every customer matters, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or how much they paid for their ticket. If you are unwilling to uphold these new standards, you are free to leave. This is not a request. This is a new era for Silver Skies Airlines. I expect every single one of you to take this seriously, because I do. Malcolm West, CEO. The aftermath of the announcement. Caroline typed furiously, sending the message to every employee's inbox and phone within minutes. The entire company would wake up to a new Silver Skies Airlines tomorrow. A few executives paled, already imagining the mass exodus of employees who would quit rather than change. And that was fine with Malcolm. If they leave, they were never meant to be here. The meeting continued for hours. New policies were drafted, crisis management teams were mobilized, and disciplinary actions were prepared for the long overdue reckoning. The floodgates open. As Malcolm left the boardroom, his phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from news agencies, activist groups, and even government regulators flooded in. The public was watching. But more importantly, employees started speaking up. Within hours of Malcolm's announcement, hundreds of emails and messages poured in from staff members and flight attendants. Some thanked him. Others confessed what they had seen behind closed doors: racism, classism, mistreatment of passengers, and even internal bullying. For years, employees had been afraid to report misconduct. Now, with Malcolm leading the charge, they felt safe to tell the truth. Lisa's final downfall. As Malcolm sat in his office, reviewing the flood of reports, an email caught his eye. It was from Cynthia, the young flight attendant who had helped him after Lisa spilled coffee on him. Her message was short, but explosive. "Sir, I need to tell you something about Lisa. This isn't the first time she's done something like this. I've personally seen her ignore Black and Latino passengers. She's told me before that some passengers just don't deserve good service. I didn't speak up because I was afraid, but I won't be silent anymore." Malcolm stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Lisa hadn't just mistreated him. She had been doing this for years, and no one stopped her. Until now. He picked up his phone, dialing HR immediately. "I want Lisa blacklisted from the airline industry. Send her file to every major airline. Make sure no one hires her again." HR hesitated. "Are you sure, sir?" Malcolm's voice was cold, final, unyielding. "Yes. I don't just want her gone from Silver Skies. I want her joined from aviation. Forever." Lisa had burned her bridges. And now, there was nothing left for her. The start of a new era. By midnight, Malcolm stood by his office window, staring down at the city lights. Silver Skies would never be the same again. There was still work to do. More policies to change, more investigations to conduct, more leaders to hold accountable. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Hope that Silver Skies Airlines would finally become what he had always dreamed it could be. A place where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. The storm wasn't over. But Malcolm was ready for it, because he was done watching from the sidelines. He was here to fight, and he wasn't backing down, breaking the chains of silence. The storm that Malcolm West had unleashed was no longer just an internal company matter. It was everywhere. Silver Skies Airlines was trending worldwide, not because of a new route, a luxury upgrade, or a marketing campaign, but because of the reckoning within its walls. The CEO had gone undercover, exposed systemic discrimination, and taken swift action. The world was watching, and Malcolm was just getting started. A firestorm in the media. By morning, every major news network had picked up the story. CEO of Silver Skies goes undercover, exposes discrimination in his own airline. Silver Skies in crisis. Malcolm West declares zero tolerance for racism and bias. Passengers speak out. A history of mistreatment comes to light. Silver Skies Airlines was in the spotlight. And Malcolm, he was being hailed as a revolutionary, a leader willing to take action, a CEO who wasn't afraid to burn down the toxic culture in his own company. But not everyone was celebrating. The old guard within Silver Skies, executives who had spent years ignoring complaints, were terrified. They knew that if Malcolm kept digging, their own negligence would be exposed. And Malcolm wasn't stopping anytime soon. A meeting with the people who mattered most. Malcolm wasn't interested in sitting in a boardroom full of executives anymore. He wanted to hear from the people who mattered most, the employees who worked directly with passengers every day. So instead of spending the morning dealing with corporate damage control, Malcolm walked straight into the employee lounge at Silver Sky's headquarters. When he entered, the room fell silent. Flight attendants, pilots, customer service reps, dozens of employees stared at him in shock. Most CEOs never stepped foot in the employee lounge. But Malcolm, he was different. He wasn't here for PR. He wasn't here for fake apologies. He was here to listen. "All right," Malcolm said, his voice calm but commanding. "Talk to me." The employees hesitated. They had never been given a real platform to speak. But then, one young black flight attendant stepped forward. Her name tag read Naomi. "Sir, I've worked here for 5 years. I love my job, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen what happened to you, happen to other passengers." Malcolm nodded. "Go on." Naomi swallowed hard. Some flight attendants treat Black and Latino passengers differently. They assume they won't complain. They assume they won't leave reviews. And if they do, the complaints get ignored. I've seen flight attendants laugh about it in the break rooms. I've heard them say things like, "Well, they only bought the cheapest ticket. Why should I go out of my way for them?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. His stomach churned. This wasn't just about Lisa. This was a cultural disease, and it had been allowed to fester for too long. Then, another employee spoke up, an Asian American gate agent named Marcus. "Sir, it's not just on flights. It happens at check-in too. I've seen passengers of color get extra security checks for no reason. I've seen agents lose their upgrade requests. It's disgusting." Another flight attendant, a Latina woman named Gabriela, raised her hand. "And it's not just passengers, Mr. West. It happens to us too. I've been ignored for promotions, passed over for leadership roles. And when I try to speak up, I get told I'm not a team player." The words hit Malcolm like a gut punch. This wasn't just about customer service. It was about who Silver Skies allowed to succeed, who they protected, who they silenced. "Enough," Malcolm said, his voice low but full of power. "That all ends today." The employees stared at him, hope flickering in their eyes. For the first time, they felt like someone was actually listening. For the first time, they felt like change was coming. The next move, a company-wide purge. Malcolm walked out of the employee lounge with a mission. He was done listening. Now, it was time to act. He returned to his office, called the Director of Human Resources, and issued a simple command. "I want a list of EV or employee who has had multiple complaints filed against them." The HR director hesitated. "Sir, that's going to be a long list." Malcolm's expression didn't change. "Then get started, because by the end of this week, they're gone." The HR director paled, realizing what Malcolm meant. This wasn't just a training refresh. This wasn't just sensitivity workshops. This was a full-blown purge. And Malcolm wasn't backing down. The call that changed everything. As Malcolm worked late into the night, his phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered anyway. "Mr. West," the voice on the other end said. "I think we need to talk." Malcolm froze. He recognized the voice instantly. It was Lisa, the disgraced flight attendant he had fired. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone tightly. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," Malcolm said coldly. Lisa laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, but we do. You see, Mr. West, I know things, and if you don't want this airline to fall apart, you'll listen to me." Malcolm's blood ran cold. What did she know? And why did she sound so confident? Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper. "I wasn't the only one, Mr. West. There are people at the top, executives, board members, who knew exactly what was happening. And they let it happen." Malcolm's breathing slowed. "Give me names." Lisa chuckled. Now, you fired me, remember? Why would I just hand them over?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. What do you want? Lisa hesitated. Meet me. 1 hour. The old airport diner on 5th Street. No security. Just you. Then she hung up. Malcolm sat in silence, gripping his phone. Lisa wasn't just a disgruntled former employee. She was a key to something much bigger. Something darker. Something that went far beyond her mistreatment of passengers. There was a conspiracy inside Silver Skies Airlines. And Malcolm was about to tear it apart. The secret that could destroy Silver Skies Airlines. Malcolm stared at his phone, his grip tightening. Lisa's voice still echoed in his mind. There are people at the top, executives, board members, who knew exactly what was happening. And they let it happen. Malcolm had gone undercover to fix his airline. But now he had stumbled upon something even bigger. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's bias. This was about corruption at the highest levels of Silver Skies Airlines. And he was about to walk straight into it. A dangerous meeting. Malcolm's car pulled up to the diner on 5th Street, an old, run-down place near the airport. The kind of place where disgruntled employees met to whisper about bad bosses. The kind of place where secrets were exchanged in hushed voices over cold coffee. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and every head turned toward him. A few people recognized him, but no one said a word. Lisa was already seated at the back booth, stirring a cup of coffee, her eyes sharp. The moment she saw him, a smirk spread across her face. Didn't think you'd actually come, Mr. West. Malcolm slid into the booth across from her, his face expressionless. Start talking. Lisa leaned back, tilting her head slightly, as if savoring the moment. You think what I did was bad. She took a sip of her coffee. You have no idea what's really going on. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Then enlighten me. Lisa sighed dramatically. Silver Skies doesn't just have a customer service problem, Mr. West. It has a corruption problem. Malcolm didn't blink. Prove it. Lisa pulled out a flash drive, spinning it between her fingers. Everything's on here. Emails, documents, even security footage. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You have executives protecting flight attendants like me. You have managers covering up discrimination complaints. And you have board members who are making sure nothing ever changes. Malcolm's stomach tightened. Why are you telling me this? Lisa shrugged. Because if I go down, I'm not going down alone. Malcolm reached for the flash drive, but Lisa yanked it back. Not so fast. I'd want something in return. Malcolm's patience was wearing thin. What do you want? Lisa's eyes darkened. A severance package. And a guarantee that I won't be blacklisted from the airline industry. Malcolm let out a slow, deliberate breath. You think you deserve that? Lisa's smirk widened. I think you don't have a choice. The flash drive of truth. 2 hours later, Malcolm was back at Silver Skies headquarters, sitting in his private office, staring at the flash drive in his hand. He had already sent a copy to his personal lawyer, just in case. Now he needed to see the truth for himself. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop and opened the first file. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Emails from HR covering up discrimination complaints. Internal memos warning against excessive diversity training. Surveillance footage showing first-class passengers getting priority treatment at check-in while others were ignored. Flight attendants laughing about problem passengers who didn't belong in business class. And then, the worst document of all, an email chain from a high-ranking executive. We need to stop catering to passengers who don't bring us value. Focus on our premium clients. The rest will complain, but they always come back. Malcolm's fingers tightened into fists. He scrolled down. More emails. More cover-ups. More evidence that the board knew exactly what was happening. And they didn't care. Malcolm leaned back, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a PR disaster. This was a full-scale corporate scandal. and he was about to detonate it. The boardroom showdown. By the time the emergency board meeting was called, the atmosphere was suffocating. The executives were sweating. They knew something was wrong, but they had no idea what was coming. Malcolm walked in without a word, dropping a thick folder of printed emails and documents onto the table. "Read it." The chairman of the board picked up a page, his face slowly draining of color. Another executive coughed, pretending to look confused. "Malcolm, where did you get this?" Malcolm's eyes burned with fury. "From someone who was part of your cover-up." The executives shifted uncomfortably. "So here's what's going to happen. Every single executive involved in this mess is fired." The room erupted into chaos. "Malcolm, be reasonable. We can handle this internally." "There's no need to." Malcolm slammed his fist on the table. "You think I'm going to handle this internally? You think I'm going to let you all walk away clean? I am Silver Skies Airlines, and I refuse to let this company rot from the inside." One of the executives sneered. "You don't have the power to do this alone, Malcolm." Malcolm smiled. And then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a document signed by every major shareholder, a document giving him full authority to clean house. The executives' faces went pale. Effective immediately, every corrupt executive in this room is gone. Security walked in. The executives were escorted out. Some cursed him out. Some tried to threaten him. But Malcolm didn't flinch. As the last of them disappeared, he turned to the remaining board members, the ones who had never been part of the corruption. "We rebuild from here. Silver Skies will become what it was always meant to be. A company that treats everyone with dignity." A long silence followed. Then, one by one, the board members nodded. They were with him. The old Silver Skies Airlines was dead. And Malcolm West, he had just saved his company from the inside out. A new era begins. 1 week later, Malcolm stood in front of a massive crowd of employees. A press conference was being broadcast live. He stood at the podium, looking out at thousands of faces: flight attendants, pilots, check-in agents, passengers. The future of Silver Skies Airlines. He took a deep breath. And then he spoke. "The past ends today. Silver Skies Airlines will no longer tolerate discrimination. We will no longer protect those who mistreat others. We are moving forward with honesty, accountability, and integrity." The crowd erupted into applause. And Malcolm West, he had just secured his place in history. The CEO who changed everything. The man who stood up for what was right, and the leader who refused to back down.